I hope to impress on you again that it is an honor to serve the American people in your company. Thank you, fellow senators. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
That was John McCain's final floor speech. Now, in a moment, we're going to be joined by Hardball's Chris Matthews. But first, let's bring in Mark Salter, John McCain's friend, frequent collaborator, former chief of staff and speechwriter. Mark also co-authored John McCain's last memoir, The Restless Wave, which was published this past May. He's also out with his latest piece in the Washington Post entitled John McCain Spent His Life Serving the Dignity of His Fellow Man. And Mark, we know it's got to be tough for you to be here today. We're so grateful that you are. We've been talking, we've been remembering John McCain and, what a tough guy he was, what a loving guy he was, what an uncompromising guy he was. But you knew him better than anybody outside the family. What was it about John McCain that you loved?
Oh, his instinctive decency, his enthusiasm for life, his love of a good fight. There's nothing he ever liked to do more than fight bad guys to help little guys. And working for him, it was hectic, very busy, exuberant, lively, fun, purposeful, satisfying experience. And I can't say I enjoyed every day of it, but I enjoyed most of it, and it was a great honor.
You know, we've been talking about how John McCain was unique among his peers in Washington. And I saw one or two, and David Brooks brought this up too, I saw one or two people remembering John McCain talking about his raw ambition. I never saw that in John McCain. I saw raw anger a lot, but it seems to me that he was, of all the great political figures, certainly of my lifetime, he was probably the least calculated. John McCain could have made his life a hell of a lot easier in Washington, D.C. if he had a raw hunger for power. But the guy was following ideals and a higher calling, wasn't he?
Yeah. I mean, he may have been calculating once or twice or something, but he could never stick to his calculations. So he wanted to be useful. He wanted to do important things. He wanted to fight for things he believed in. He was never good at a script. You could never get him to. We used to laugh about message discipline with him. It was pointless to try to encourage him. But he did want to do big things, and he had ambition. He got pretty far in life for a guy who, as he always pointed out, stood fifth from the bottom of his class at the Naval Academy. But when I wrote about his romantic sensibility, it was just that he wanted to go out in that world and help people enjoy, the kind of life he had, the rights and freedoms that he enjoyed. And he couldn't stand bullies. He loved fighting them. And we're going to miss that about him.
So, Mark, so many people have been going back to that clip where he talked to the woman at the rally in 2008, defended Barack Obama. I'm curious, outside of that moment, of all the things you saw up close with John McCain, of all the reasons he gave you to be proud to be associated with John McCain, can you think of a moment this morning that stands out to you?
Oh, there's just so many. He's just such a decent fellow. You walk through an airport with him. Obviously, he was a nationally known politician and a celebrity, and he'd always be in danger of not making his plane because he would be waylaid by people passing him, for a selfie and sign something for them or something. He would just always stop, and he said, and I would always say, "We got to hurry up. We got to hurry up." And he goes, "Someday they're not going to want me to do this." So, but there was something I was recalling today when. Not long after he was first diagnosed, we were out here, probably right after he had come back to Washington and made that speech, and they had the Obamacare vote, and we were at his condo in Phoenix. I went over there for dinner with Cindy and Megan and John, and When I walked in, he was. He'd just been given a terminal diagnosis, and he was sitting at a table with a list of names of family members from the USS John McCain, who had been whose loved ones had been killed in the accident that had just happened. He was calling each and every one of them to express his condolences and to ask them what he could do for them, and then he would assign staff to go out and take care of whatever they needed. And it was just in that moment, just his typical decency that really drove the guy.
All right, Mark, thank you for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Joe. Yeah.
Please pass along our thoughts and our love to Cindy and Megan and the entire family.
I sure will, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's. All right, thank you so much. Let's bring in Chris Matthews now with Hardball. And Mike Barnicle, why don't you take the first question?
Yeah, Joe, you know, just listening to Mark Salter talk about a public man who is just so drenched in humanity and character and honesty and compassion and humor. It stops you in your tracks to think with what we're surrounded with today. And Chris Matthews, you've seen a lot in your lifetime, and you've interviewed a lot of people in your lifetime. And today, many of us are worried about the resilience of the Republic, given the fact that John McCain has passed. We wonder where men like him would come from, or where people like him would come from, men and women. But it's always struck me, and I'm wondering if it has struck you, that part of the resilience of this country is reflected in the resilience that John McCain displayed in his entire life.
Well, first of all, I'm sorry about your brother, and you're something else, buddy. Anyway, I think he had a romance about being a senator, and I just want to talk about that a minute, because I think a lot of us, Joe and Mike, we grew up with a U.S. senator is supposed to be a person who really marks his own or her own trail. You're out there on your own. You're kind of like a fighter pilot. You're going to be tough. You're going to have enemies, but you're going to be yourself. And at the end of your day, you're going to bid yourself. You're going to bid, in this case, John McCain, not somebody else's guy. And I think fighting is part of that. And I think having enemies is part of that. And I think in a classic sense, like in a novel, like one of my favorites, Advise and Consent, he was out there all alone like Brigham Anderson. I mean, he was a guy who had to face people who were willing to do horrible things to beat him. And he had to be himself and stick to that and have an ideal. And I think he was that, the classic, almost out of a novel, U.S. senator. And I think that's who he was. He was tough as nails. I mean, everybody's a journalist went up against the guy. I went up against him in the beginning about it. He had parked illegally, not illegally, he parked on a fire hydrant at some event I was covering or attending, and I called him on it. I said, how can you do that? This is during the whole Keating 5 thing. And I said, why'd you do that? And he just says, well, you guys all had drivers. I had to park illegally. And I just said, and he says, what, are you going to burn me? But he called me back. He didn't futz around. He called me back and argued with me on the phone. And in all the years, this is 20-some years ago, I don't think he held it against me. I think he could repress some of his anger as a professional, because he knew it would get in the way of him being a great senator, Mike. And I think he didn't just let it all hang out. I think the guy about Vietnam, he had reasons to resent people who didn't serve, like W. and like Clinton. And he didn't get that. I think it's so amazing he's got W speaking at his funeral, that he chose to do that, Mike. It tells me he wanted to be a great senator and a great figure, and he was willing to pay a personal price for that.
Chris, Peggy Noonan here. Good morning.
I miss your column, dear.
Oh, coming back soon.
You're like Walter Cronkite. You take the summer off. My God.
Chris, you knew John McCain. You observed him, watched him, talked to him over the decades. I've been curious. Do you think he had a sense of destiny, personal destiny? Did you get a sense of what his sense of his destiny was? What I'm asking is, who did he think he was in history?
I think he was his biography. I think Vietnam put a mark on him like it did on all of us. And I think I find myself still fighting that war from my side. I was against the war. I didn't serve. I was in the Peace Corps in Africa. He fought over there. He whatever got captured. He was a pilot, got shot down going into the enemy capital, pulled out of the water, beat up for 7 years or 5.5 years. That's his life, and I think he was hawkish out of that. He never, I'm telling you, when you talk to him in the old days, he would say, he was really hated what Lyndon Johnson did in that war, where he wouldn't fight the war to a finish. They cheered when Nixon bombed over Hanoi. They were all cheering these guys being beat up, but they wanted to win the war, and they wanted decisiveness in their leadership. They didn't want futzing around like Johnson was doing. And, you know, he quoted from One-Eyed Jacks, one of the movies they used to put on over there from memory about, you're a scum-sucking pig. I mean, the anger he had against Johnson, he was quoting, you know, Marlon Brando in that movie. He had this real anger at the failure of leadership. I think he wanted to be a clear-cut leader. And when we got into Iraq, which I didn't like, but we got into Iraq, he said, we're going to damn well win this thing. And I think he wanted to be a real leader like John Wayne or the heroes you and I grew up with, Peggy. And I think he wanted to be that kind of hero leader. I think he had that romance. And it was very clear cut. He wanted to be the hero of the story. And he wanted to be president of the United States, Tom. And he ran, and he should have won. He was winning in South Carolina, so they destroyed him. He went after his family, his daughter, his wife. And that was a pretty rotten campaign, but they beat him, and he went back against Obama. And then he said those wonderful things about Obama at the Al Smith dinner. I watched it about it's not just with that lady who called him an Arab. He went out there and talked about what an honorable man it was and what a good guy was. I hope we play that tape a few times of what he said at the Smith dinner about his opponent. And he was losing to him. This is 2.5 weeks before the election. Yeah. And he was about to lose to this guy, and yet he paid tremendous American tribute to the guy. I mean, how many politicians know how to do that? Not the one we have leading us today. And I think he was a hero to himself, and he wanted to be one.
And Chris, it's Kathy. You know, it's an indication of the measure of the man that he's going to have the two people who defeated him in elections speaking at his funeral. But I think John McCain would be the first to admit that he wasn't perfect. He could be prickly, as anyone who tried to interview him at some point has always known, and irascible, and he made mistakes. He made them through the course of his political career, perhaps most notably with the pick of Sarah Palin for his vice presidential candidate back in 2008. But one of the things I thought, and I don't know how much you picked this up from him, Chris, was that he was prepared to admit those mistakes. And how rare is that in this political world? And he did after Sarah Palin. He effectively said, look, I should have chosen Joe Lieberman. Now, maybe that wasn't the right political choice for him either, but he effectively said that was not the right choice. And I made it for political calculation. And whenever he made things for political calculation, as he said on Meet the Press, it wasn't the right way to go.
You know, that's true. I think he was a Mick. I think he'd like to fight. Bobby Kennedy liked to fight. John McEnroe liked to fight. I think we make a mistake in assuming that pugilism, that going out there and taking punches and hitting somebody else, isn't part of politics. It's a competitive sport. It's bodily sometimes. It's a blood sport at times. I think he enjoyed that part of it. I think Franklin Roosevelt said, "There's nothing I like more than a good fight." And I think everybody talking right now enjoys a good fight. And I think it's a big part of life is competition. And I think if you're in the ring, you're in the ring. And I think he'd love to take on us. I mean, he had the press with him in 2000. He didn't have us with him in 2008. And he'd love to come back and take shots at you. He did it to me one time. He was quite public about it. He said, Chris used to like me. Now he's fallen someone new. He's found someone new. I mean, he just took shots, and he didn't like it at all. I mean, he liked us being with him. He called us his base. And then we went. A lot of us went with Obama and our sentiments, and he didn't like that at all. And I understand that. That's human, and he was definitely human. Definitely human, Katie. I mean, Caddy. He was definitely human.
Yeah, he certainly was. But again, it's been said here before. He understood that he needed to work through that. He needed to have that short memory for the business that he did, well, and he certainly had a short memory when it came to me. He was gracious. Hardball's Chris Matthews. We really appreciate you being with us, and
Joe.
Can't wait
good you're doing this.
to watch your. Can't wait to watch your show tonight at 7 o'clock Eastern. Hardball. Now, as we go to break, The moment Chris just mentioned from the Al Smith dinner back in 2008. This is John McCain just weeks before a presidential election he was expected to lose.
I don't want it getting out of this room, but my opponent is an impressive fellow in many ways. Political opponents can have a little trouble seeing the best in each other, but I've had a few glimpses of this man at his best, and I admire his great skill, energy, and determination. It's not for nothing that he's inspired so many folks in his own party and beyond. Senator Obama talks about making history, and he's made quite a bit of it already. There was a time when the mere invitation of an African-American citizen to dine at the White House was taken as an outrage and an insult in many quarters. Today is a world away from the cruel and prideful bigotry of that time, and good riddance. I can't wish my opponent luck, but I do wish him well.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.